Hello, everyone. Today, we're going to be talking about climate change, specifically how it affects poor countries. So, what exactly is climate change? A lot of the time, people think climate change is just the warming of the earth, when in reality, climate change refers to long-term changes in the average weather patterns on Earth. This includes shifts in temperature, precipitation, and wind patterns. Climate change is primarily caused by human activities, particularly the burning of fossil fuels, which include coal, oil, and gas, which release greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere, trapping heat and warming the planet. So, why are poor countries more vulnerable? Well, they have limited resources for adaptation. Poor countries often lack the financial resources, infrastructure, and technology to be able to cope with climate change. Infrastructure are often small buildings made out of materials that are not going to be able to resist natural disasters. Also, dependence on climate sensitivity sectors. Many low-income countries rely heavily on agriculture, fisheries, and tourism, all of which are highly vulnerable to climate change. Weak governance and institutions also have an effect. Poor governance structures and lack of disaster management systems make it harder to respond to and recover from climate impacts. So, what are some examples of climate change impacts? Well, this can include rising temperatures, heat waves, longer dry periods, and changing growing seasons. Extreme weather events like natural disasters, more frequent hurricanes, floods, and cyclones cause damages to homes, infrastructure, and livelihoods. Sea level rise is also an effect. Coastal communities in countries like Bangladesh, the Maldives, and small island nations face displacement and loss of land. Droughts and water scarcity are a big factor for climate change. Reduced access to clean water can affect agriculture, health, and livelihood. Loss of biodiversity, destruction of ecosystems that provide vital resources for food, water, and medicine. Health risks are very important. Increased spread of diseases like malaria and cholera are due to changing rainfall patterns and temperatures. What are the impacts on agriculture and food security? Well, crop failures, extreme weather like floods and droughts lead to crop losses, reducing food availability. As this food runs scarce, supplies drops, food prices increase, making it even harder for poor populations to afford basic necessities. There's also cause for famine. Countries in Africa and Asia that are heavily dependent on subsistence farming are at increased risk of food insecurity. What are the impacts on livelihood? Well, loss of agricultural jobs, migration to urban areas, and pressure on social systems are all impacts that can be affected. What are the economic impacts? Well, damage to infrastructure. Severe storms and flooding can destroy roads, buildings, and energy systems, resulting in costly rebuilding efforts. Decreased productivity. Extreme weather, water shortages, and disrupted supply chains slow down industrial production. This increases poverty. Loss of livelihood, lower incomes, and rising costs of living push more people into poverty. Let's take a look at Sub-Saharan Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa has been facing increasing droughts and erratic rainfall patterns, especially in East Africa, Southern Africa, and the Horn of Africa. Countries like Ethiopia, Somalia, and Kenya have faced devastating droughts in recent years. Impacts on agriculture. Many countries in Sub-Saharan Africa rely heavily on rain-fed agriculture. Changing in rainfall patterns, longer dry spells, and irregular seasons have caused significant crop failures. For example, the 2016-2017 drought in East Africa, severely affected the food security of over 20 million people. Droughts led to poor crop yields, loss of livestock, and reduced access to water. This caused hunger, malnutrition, especially in rural areas where people depend on agriculture for their livelihoods. What are the economic impacts? Well, agriculture accounts for a large portion of the GDP in many sub-Saharan countries. A decline in agriculture productivity due to climate change is a direct blow to these economies, pushing people deeper into poverty. On the right is a picture of the Horn of Africa, which faced a severe drought in 2011, with Somalia suffering the worst effects. Over 13 million people were affected, and famine was declared in parts of Somalia. This crisis led to thousands of deaths and widespread displacement. So what are some of the social and health impacts? Well, like said before, displacement and migration. Climate-induced migration due to sea level rise, floods, or droughts creates climate refugees. Health risks. Increase in malnutrition, waterborne diseases like cholera, and vector-borne diseases like malaria are due to shifting weather patterns. Inequality is another impact. The poor, women, and children are more likely to suffer the health and social consequences of climate change. So whose responsibility is it, and who's going to share their funds? Well, developed nations, particularly those in North America and Europe, are historically responsible for the majority of greenhouse gas emissions. Since the Industrial Revolution, these countries have been the main drivers of climate change. Developing countries, or nations, by contrast, have contributed far less to global emissions, but are disproportionately affected by the impacts of climate change. This being sea level rise, droughts, and extreme weather. So what are some of the funds that can help? Well, the Green Climate Fund, the GCF, was established to help developing countries mitigate and adapt to the impacts of climate change by providing financial support. It aims to raise $100 billion per year to support adaptation and low carbon development. Another fund is the Adaptation Fund, which supports vulnerable countries by financing projects that help communities adapt to the impacts of climate change, such being building resilient infrastructure, improving water management, and strengthening agricultural practices so that agriculture can withstand natural disasters. United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is a key international organization that coordinates global climate efforts and supports financial mechanisms like the GCF and Adaptation Fund. So, what are the solutions and adaptation strategies? Well, we can take adaptation measures like early warning systems to warn for natural disasters, improved infrastructure that will be able to withstand these natural disasters, water conservation techniques to be able to have fresh water at any time, and sustainable agricultural practices to be able to have food security during natural disasters. Also, a renewable energy investment would be able to support clean energy technologies like solar and wind to be able to reduce dependence on fossil fuels. Communities can also be a big solution. Empower local communities to design and implement climate resilient practices, like being able to help in natural disasters. Lastly, climate financing. An increased climate finance to help low-income countries mitigate and adapt to climate change. This would be through international climate agreements. Here are my references used for my presentation. Thank you for listening about how poor countries are affected by climate change and how we might be able to help these poor countries withstand these natural disasters caused by climate change.